Well, hello and welcome to Reflections. My name is Larry Totzke and I'm one of the Bible teachers here at Oak Hills Presbyterian Church. And usually I do this in a conversational mode with Pastor Jeremy, but he's not available this week, so it's just me. And I'm here talking about a passage in 1 Kings chapter 18 about a very interesting and famous Old Testament prophet named Elijah. But before I get into the passage, I need to tell you some backstory, just for context. So Elijah was called to prophesy to the nation of Israel. And if you'll remember, back when King Solomon passed away, God chose to divide the promised land into two different kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and its capital was Samaria. And the southern kingdom was called Judah, and its capital was Jerusalem. And so Elijah was called to prophesy to Samaria during the reign of the king named Ahab. And here's what the Bible says about Ahab. Ahab did more evil in Israel than all kings who went before him. Wow. And adding to that, Ahab married a non-Jewish woman by the name of Jezebel, and she was more evil than Ahab was. And so this is the context in which Elijah was called to prophesy. And so God told Elijah to go to King Ahab and to tell him that it wasn't going to rain in Israel until Elijah came back and told him that it was going to rain. And then Elijah went away. And he did a number of other things. And it wasn't until about 3 years later until Elijah was told to go back to King Ahab and say, now God's going to make it rain. And so when Elijah appeared before Ahab, Ahab said something like, "You troublemaker, you're finally back." And Elijah says, "I'm sorry, but I'm not the troublemaker. You are. You and your wife, and you're worshiping all the prophets of Baal. That's what God's upset about. And before I tell you that it's going to rain, I need to do something about these prophets of Baal." And so God had told Elijah what to do, and basically Elijah was able to defeat 450 of the prophets of Baal by calling down fire from above to burn up a sacrifice. And they weren't able, even though they tried all day, they weren't able to do that. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 18. And so when Ahab told his wife Jezebel about that, she got really angry. And she put out the word that she was going to get Elijah, and she was going to do the same to him that he had done to the prophets of Baal. So Elijah got scared, and he ran. And our text finds Elijah in a cave. And we're in Proverbs. We're in 1 Kings chapter 19, and I'm in the bottom part of verse 9, and it says this: "Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' Elijah answered, 'I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars.'" Let's try that again. I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Elijah was scared, and so when God approached him and asked him why he was in the cave, he let him know for certain. Not only that, but Elijah had been successful in his assignment to deal with the prophets of Baal, and he was disappointed because nothing had changed. Ahab was still alive. Jezebel was still alive. The people were still worshiping idols. And as far as Elijah knew, it was only he who was loving and worshiping God. And here's what God said. God said, "Go out and stand on the mountains before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks to pieces before the Lord. The winds were so strong they were of tornado strength or worse. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake came. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire came. But the Lord was not in the fire. And I find this very, very interesting. God was in the fire when Elijah called down fire to burn the sacrifice on the altar. But even more importantly, let's go back to probably the most honored figure in Israel's history, Moses. And think about this. When God first met Moses, he met him in a burning bush. God was in the fire of the bush. And everybody in Israel knew that. And then when God caused the Egyptians to allow the Israelites to go and escape, they came to the Red Sea. And what was it that parted the waters of the Red Sea? It was a wind. God was in the wind. And then the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and they made it to Mount Sinai. And God said to Moses, "Bring the people around the mountain. I want to speak to them." And before he spoke to them, the mountain shook, and fire belched out, and basically there was an earthquake and a volcano, and God was in that. So the Israelites knew, and Elijah knew, that God had been in the fire, and God had been in the wind, and God had been in the earthquake before. But in this case, God wasn't in any of those three as he was about to pass by before Elijah. Picking back up in the passage, it says, "But the Lord was not in the earthquake. The Lord was not in the fire. But after the fire, there was a sound of sheer silence." Did you get that? There was a sound of sheer silence. Have you ever been in complete silence? It's so ironic to say the word sound of silence. But that's what real silence feels like. The other day, I had a chance to be with about 5 other people at someone's backyard. We were having a meeting, and we decided to take about 5 minutes to just be quiet and to pray and to do some thinking. And while we were sitting there, the sun was out, the sky was a beautiful blue, and the trees were green, and there were no lawnmowers, there were no power tools, there were no children playing, there were no dogs barking. It was quiet. And I just sat there for a couple of minutes, enjoying the sound of silence. It was so cool. And that's where God was as he appeared to Elijah. But God was in the silence. When Elijah heard it, when he heard the silence, I love it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Elijah was fearful at the silence, so he wrapped his face in his mantle. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answered, "Lord, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left. And they are seeking my life to take it away. Then the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram, and also you shall anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha as prophet in your place. And then he said, And I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Basically, God shared with Elijah what God was going to do. And I think Elijah maybe was thinking that God wanted him to do something more to cause the Israelites to turn back to him. And yet God had his plan already made. He already had a person to appoint as king in replacement of Ahab. He already had a prophet in the waiting to replace Elijah as prophet. And he told Elijah that, no, you're not alone. There are at least 7,000 people in Israel who haven't bowed the knee to worship these false prophets. I've got a plan, Elijah. I just want you to know that. And it's interesting that this plan didn't happen and take place overnight. It took several years before Ahab died and Jezebel died. It took more time before Elijah was actually taken up alive into heaven and Elisha replaced him as prophet. But God was in charge. And God wanted to allow Elijah during the silence to just understand what it was all about. And I have to think about what's going on today in our world. And I think Pastor Jeremy made a really, really important point on Sunday. Jeremy said this. He said, God's view won't compete with other viewpoints of the day. God's view is unique. And God's not about to compete with other viewpoints that are out there. We need to listen to God. We need to maybe wait in silence and see what God has to say to us. I want you to know this. God is in the virus. God cares very, very much about what's going on around the world and the people who are suffering and dying from this virus. I also want you to know that God is in the protests. God cares very, very much that Black Lives Matter and that people should all be treated with respect. God cares about that. And God also is in all the political upheaval that's going on. God cares. But I know I haven't heard from God yet what I'm to do in any of these things other than to pray and other than to wait. And so I really enjoy times of silence. Sometimes my times of silence come in the middle of the night when I wake up. And that's been happening to me for years. And I used to think, oh man, I just want to go back to sleep. You know, now I don't feel that way anymore. I enjoy these times of silence. I enjoy the darkness. I enjoy just listening. And sometimes God, in his way, gives me insight into actions I should take, thoughts I should have, confessions I should make, prayers I should make, people I should talk to, whatever. It comes in the sounds of silence. And so I just suggest to you these days, maybe it would be a good idea to listen for God's voice in the silence. Thanks for this time together. May God bless you.